Thank you. Here are my disclosures. So here's what we know about total hips. It's a great surgery. High patient satisfaction. We know that metal-on-metal bearings generally tend to be bad. We know that cross-linked polyethylene is good. And we know that total hips provide a significant improvement in quality of life. What's not evidence-based? Well, I gave this talk about 5 years at the UCI Resident Day, and when I gave this talk, most of what I'm going to talk about wasn't evidence-based. I will say that the evidence is growing to support robotics, and I will also say that if we're still using 36 millimeter cobalt and chromium heads, be very, very careful on those things. That's just my plug. I think cobalt and chromium is going to be the next big problem 15 years, 20 years down the line. Large diameter cobalt and chromium heads are going to be a problem, I believe. What problems are we trying to solve? Well, you know, total hips, I think anyone that does them, we know that there can be the good, the bad, and the ugly. And most are good. Even if the x-rays don't look good, a lot of these people do really, really well for a fairly long period of time. There's the bad and there's the ugly, and that's for, you know, another discussion. But what we know is that how does the total hip go in? There's a lot of debate on what the best approach is, what hip replacement we use. But really, I think there's a lot of good evidence to show, at least to a certain degree, how we put the implants in and the position that they go in really can have a dependent on outcome. So I think a lot of experienced surgeons who do a lot of total hip replacements have relatively high accuracy when they put these things in, but they're still not perfect. What we really need to strive for is high accuracy and high precision. We have historically used things like preoperative templating, which I think has a lot of pitfalls, intraoperative imaging, which you can either use fluoroscopy or you use plain radiographs. There's a lot of issues with fluoro. I think we all know that fluoro tends to lie, and you have to be very careful. And there's historically been computer-assisted surgery, which, you know, 10, 15 years ago certainly had its pitfalls as well. So what are we talking about when we're talking about computer-assisted surgery? So there are passive systems, so they don't perform any surgical actions. They don't have an arm that you use. Basically, it's telling you, based on your intraoperative registration, where you're putting this cup in. There's imageless options, there's fluoroscopic options, there's AI that helps you do this. There's some really cool technologies coming down the way. And then there's semi-active systems. Now I will say semi-active, and that's what we're considering robots. There's not an option yet in medicine that lets us sit down at the pool and do total hip replacements from our, you know, from the pool on our computer. That's what I'm hoping for someday. That would be nice. But right now, the semi-active system that's available, the early semi-active systems that tend to be CT-guided based, there's all some level of advanced imaging that's needed for a lot of these systems coming down the room. And these are surgeon-guided, and they have a haptic feedback option where you kind of know where you're going. And then the active systems, you know, this is the system doing it. There's no Da Vinci-like option yet that I've seen for hip replacements. That doesn't mean that companies aren't working on it. You know, you go to the academy and you have to sign an NDA to see what people are working on. And what a lot of these companies are in very, very early genesis of trying to figure this stuff out. So the navigation, as I said, is passive. When we use navigation in general, depending on whether it's semi-active or passive, you have to put some landmark in the pelvis. So the pelvis is a rigid point. You have to use that as a reference point when you're looking at things like the acetabular placement. And then you have to do registration points intraoperatively, whether it's in the wound or outside of the wound, really sort of depends on the system. And what do these do? They help us control abduction and eversion on the cup at a minimum. And then we also are using this to check leg lengths and offset. It's a little bit offset, and leg lengths is a little bit more of a complicated problem, and it's not always a for sure thing, because we all know that leg lengths have multiple factors that can contribute to what changes a leg length. It could be someone's back, it's perceived leg length discrepancies versus true leg length discrepancies coming from the actual arthritis in the hip. So what are the pitfalls of the computer-assisted navigation, the navigation thing? So it doesn't do all the work. You can poorly prepare the cup when you do these. So even though it's telling you you're reaming this at this level and you're impacting the cup, you can also, as you're impacting the cup, your arm can move. The cup may not always go in where you want it to go. Leg length and offset, it's really subjective to where you capture your preoperative registration on. So if the femur is abducted when you do it, you have to bring the femur back to that position. But again, when you use navigation or any kind of enhanced technology, you really have to have an idea before you make an incision if this patient really has a leg length. You don't want to depend on the navigation system or anything using the intraoperative landmarks to tell you, this patient's 2 centimeters short. I've had it happen multiple times where the robot says they're 3 millimeters short, and then you go feel them and they feel 2 inches short. There's something else going on there. So you have to know that before you do a single thing to the patient. And I think that's where a lot of people get themselves into trouble. They just get in there and they mindlessly use this thing and think it's gonna do the job for them. Historically, and even to this day, a lot of the robots tend to be very large. And I know I was at special surgery when Stryker acquired Mako. I will tell you, a Mako robot 10 years ago was the most painful way to do a hip replacement. The cups were popping off the impactors, the robots were breaking. There was a large abandonment rate in people in hospitals who had spent these money on these robots and them just bailing on these robots. But we know about computer navigation system, and I kind of lump a lot of robotics into computer navigation because it's the same thing. We know that when we use computer navigation, we have less variability in the cup placement, where we want it to go in terms of inclination and anteversion, and we have a higher likelihood of placing the cup in the Lewinick safe zone. Is there a clinical difference? Well, I will tell you that this is something that we're just starting to realize, and I'm not sure we're going to actually have the answer because I don't really believe it makes a clinical difference in the first 2 months or 6 months. What I think we're going to see is who's going to have these surviving prostheses longer, and hip replacements do fairly well, but they do well assuming that most of them go in at a reasonable place. The robots are going to really help us with the outliers. Here's one thing. Here's a paper that came out in 2019, Rush, Navigation-Assisted Surgery, and this is not robotics, but this is all navigation. They saw fewer cup revisions and fewer dislocation rates when some sort of computer-assisted surgery was used. So the clinical evidence is certainly growing. There's a lot of systems coming to the market. There are the open platform systems that you can adopt and you can use with any implant, and then there is the closed platform systems. The open platform systems tend to be a little less expensive because they want you to adopt the technology and you use it for whomever you want, and then you can save the money on your implant negotiations. They usually charge you if you don't buy it outright on a per case system. So how do you reliably execute your plan? So I put this up here because it's amazing. Has anyone looked at the parking lot here? So who knows what a Tesla, who's driven a Tesla? I have 2 of them. I thought I would have never have assisted. So who thinks Teslas are just cars? These are driving robots. I mean, it's amazing, the autonomous system. When you get in this car and you say, hey, I want to go here. I mean, it's a semi-active autonomous system that's blowing up. I mean, Tesla sold like 350,000 cars in the first quarter of this year. It's amazing. And then it is just the charging lot. You look around and they're all over the place. So these things, when you drove it, the first time I drove my wife's Tesla to Las Vegas, it was like, wow, this is so much easier than driving a car. You put the autopilot on and you sit there and you're not supposed to be checking your text messages, but you check your text messages. I mean, it's really pretty safe. And I think we're gonna see the explosion of autopilot stuff in other aspects of our life. The other thing is that, and it was said yesterday, there hasn't been an industry that's adopted robotics that has abandoned robotics. So when we look at the robotics technologies, there's the imageless platforms. They don't require advanced imaging. It relies heavily on intraoperative registration, so you have to be very, very anal. So this is garbage in, garbage out. If you sit there and you're not paying attention to what you're doing, of course your x-rays aren't gonna look good. You're gonna have higher variability. There isn't a lot of preoperative templating. Again, the imageless platforms tend to be a little less expensive. If you've ever tried doing a robotic CT-assisted surgery with a commercial insurer, AIM's really coming down on approving these things. But this relies heavily on the surgeon accuracy. Then there's the image-based platforms where you have to get some sort of advanced imaging that maps the pelvis for us. So this is just an example. This is an image-based system, and this is my plan. You know, I'm going through and I'm looking at how this cup is placed. Okay, so the things I'm looking at is how's that front lip looking? Do I have to add a little bit more anteversion on so I can tuck that anterior lip in to avoid any kind of issues like psoas tendonitis? I will tell you that that's probably the bigger complaint that I have doing a lot of anterior hips is that people generally do pretty well until they develop psoas tendonitis and they hate you and you sit there and the cup looks pretty good, but what you tend to appreciate is those patients who have overly anteverted cups that you may have not put the cup in enough anteversion on. And you can use your finger and you can feel, but it's not always that easy to really tell how much anteversion is too much anteversion. So this gives you a really good idea of how to do that. And you know, this also allows us to sit there and say, hey, I'm going to tuck this cup in at these specific coordinates. And I will say that this is a pretty good gauge. There is some level of error that you have to accept, 3 to 5 degrees in any plane. But for the most part, when you're very, very particular about doing your measurements and you have a relatively recent CT, it's very helpful in doing this. Then we start to talk about the spinopelvic relationship. I mean, this whole thing, every time I read about it, it gives me a headache. I'm like, you know, this is a hard thing. This is sort of complicated math. Well, how do we achieve this stuff? I do think that they're onto something. And, you know, Dor and Viktorchek was a year ahead of me at special surgery. But this is hard. This is going to be hard to achieve with traditional methods. So, you know, you get your CT scan. You know, and these are the things that you can do. You can actually do this modeling ahead of time and say, hey, this patient's going to have an issue at X amount of hip flexion and internal rotation, so we may want to reposition the cup. What's really nice is you talk about saving time in the operating room. When these impingement systems come up, you can sit there and be like, do I really need to leave that or take that osteophyte on that's sitting, you know, it's a big osteophyte and it's sitting right next to the neurovascular bundle anteriorly. Not only that, it's not that easy to always get some of these things out and you have to mess with it. So it's a really nice technology to model hip impingement. And this is kind of what we do. This is, for those who haven't seen it, you do have to put an array in the pelvis. You use these special probes where you go in and you register your landmarks. And then the surgeon really controls a robot. It's just like getting in a Tesla. The Tesla is not going to drive here yet. And, you know, I don't know if full autopilot in the Tesla is going to go for a while. And I think the same thing's true with robots in the operating room. There's not going to be a standalone position, but you basically register. You use it to impact the cup. This is what it looks like intraoperatively. The surgeon really controls the robot, and you implant the implants based on how you are. The stem goes in, same thing, but it gives you another level of templating your stems. I can't tell you how many issues we've had with just our templating system. It drives me crazy. So, you know, there's a lot of growing literature that we see better placement of the implants. We see lower rates of things like dislocations. We see more accuracy with leg lengths. And these are all and Seth Jarabek, he's a very honest guy. I think he reports things very well as a fellow under him. And, you know, again, the patient satisfaction scores, I think it makes a difference. I think since I started doing this, I see fewer problems with things like psoas tendonitis and even hip bursitis. So the evidence is growing. There's a lot of companies coming to the market. This technology is still very expensive. It requires capital investment. There are disposables that cost money. There are pins that go in. Everything costs money here. They find ways to get it out of you. So I do think that this is the one way that we can become more accurate and precise. Here's an example that we did. This is a perfect example of where I love this technology. A lot of people will sit there and look at this like, oh, great. How am I going to get that out? So you sit there and you load this up into the CT, and you can perfectly place your cup to avoid that hardware if you need it, or you can see if the hardware is going to be in the way, and this really helps facilitate a little bit more efficient process. So we go through, we plan this, I look at the cup, I check to make sure everything's where I like it. You have multiple ways of looking at your plan before you actually do anything. This is a templated plan. This is not the implant in there in a fluoro. This is what they overlay so you can see what about you'll expect when you put this in. And this is what they look like. I didn't take any of the hardware out. I was able to plan the cup very nicely, a very fluid plan. There is a learning curve, okay? What I will tell you is that if you get through the learning curve, this becomes a more predictable surgery. I think a lot of the reasons why this technology gets abandoned so quickly is you sit there for your first one, it takes you hours to do, and you're like, oh, that was way more stressful. I'm not doing that again. Well, this is what we found. So I looked at all of these was my own data, 500 hips. By the time I really started looking at this stuff, about a quarter of them are still doing manually for more insurance reasons than anything. I do want to stress that when I use manual instruments, I use lead, which is another 30 pounds of sweat that I lose during that case, which wears me out. This is a little bit more fluid. And here's what's amazing. So you look at the patient BMI, I really don't change a lot. Male, female, all very similar. My 30-day readmission rate's about the same. Here's when I look. The top graph is my manual anterior hips. When I first started doing these in 2019, you can see the robots took me on average much longer, much higher variation rate. So this is wheels in, this is start of the case to wheels out time. So, we're taking on average about another 20 minutes per case. But as you see, as I started to get over my learning curve, that standard deviation in time started to really shorten. And by 2021, we really have this thing figured out where I'm actually I'm time neutral and I'm more predictable. So if I want to do another add-on, the OR looks at my time and they're like, you got 100 minutes to do this? Absolutely, you can do it. So they'll let me get in and out of there with potentially another case. This surgery is more predictable. We're not running over nearly as much, and it helps us plan these things. So in conclusion, we've got a very, very busy practice out here, but it takes a while. You have to get over the learning curve. Once you get over this learning curve, I think that the sky's the limit here. I don't think we're going to realize how important some of these technologies are for 10, 15 years because the durability and the implants are there. It's the things like the psoas tendonitis or maybe, the 5'2" Manolo Blahnik wearing very active lady that can feel the 3 millimeters difference in her leg lengths. Those are the things where we're making a difference with this, in my professional opinion, and I think that this is here to stay. That's it.